Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 69. This session focuses on the chronology, the history of human thought in relation to sexuality and religion. There are several points along this story, several subjects, several time periods, several subject matters that each deserve their own focused subject, their own spiritual studies session. However, our focus is the development of thought throughout this. And I think it will be clear by the end how we got where we are, why we think what we think, and what sort of battles are happening within the human psyche in regards to religion and sexuality. This subject, as it immediately meets the cultural mind, is that sexuality is taboo to religion, even so far as an abomination, that if one was to live a religiously pure life, they ought not practice sexuality. However, as we move into the past, we can see that the exercising of human sexuality has great diversity when it comes to different belief systems. This can go so far as sex worship, sexual deities, fertility ceremonies, so on and so forth, or the more modern sex magic, for instance. An instance of this ancient approach can first be observed in Southeast Asia, where archaeological sites dig these depictions of embracing couples and outright human genitalia intertwining, these symbolizing growth, prosperity, and abundance. So immediately with that just first reference, we can see the contrast, the juxtaposition between how our mind might have culturally immediately met this subject and how the practices of sexuality and symbolism of sexuality are legions far, far, far away from this modern conception. We can begin the story thus with looking at the Venus figurines, these ancient Paleolithic, dating as far back as 300,000 years ago, at least, or, whatever, of these buxom, motherly figures, these fertility deities, these ivory carvings of swollen breasts and pregnant bellies, and of course, unashamed nudity. So, if we were to dial it back into our ancient past, this nudity, this sexuality, this practice has no shame. There is nothing to be covered. This sexuality is the source of life. You came from it. Everything came from some sort of ceremonious act of sexuality. The absurdity of an exterior perspective to this as well. Two people get together, perform some sort of very specific actions that facilitate very specific innate functions of the human body, or any body, animal, what otherwise. And then there is a whole different person thing that just conjured from this. What is that? This miraculousness, this wonderment about how is that possible? What this creative act. And this wonderment is immediately tied to the woman, of course, being the bearer of this gestation, the one who brings forth creation. Thus, the goddess of fertility. This miraculous aspect that she has, somehow. And of course, as the Course has tried to elucidate several times throughout, the mentality of the ancient world and the plurality of how everything is interpreted. What do I mean? I mean, there is the microcosmic sexuality, which produces a child. But then there is the macrocosmic sexuality that produces everything that we inhabit. The grain, the mushrooms, the fruits on the tree, the trees, the animals, even things like the air and the sun. All of these things were birthed somehow. They came to be somehow. And the way that things come to be is sexually. So there is the mother, and then there is the great mother. So there's no shunning anywhere in this, of course, because it is the source. So accordingly, there is this immediate goddess of fertility before any seeming paganism, before any systems of orientation. There is first the goddess of fertility. And as that evolves into polytheism and pagan, what might be called paganism, then we see that these fertility deities start to take on their own idiosyncratic deviations, depending on what cultures they are within. So immediately we can see those that are connected specifically with the microcosmic sexual act, which is like Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sex. But then you have Demeter, for instance, that is more specifically related to that macrocosmic sexuality that produces the agriculture and the seasons. And other examples you have, for instance, Yamanja of the Yoruba people. In this case, this fertility deity represents both the individual sexuality in love and the macrocosmic sexuality in love, the agricultural, the worlds. As other diversifications, such as Astarte, which is the fertility deity of the Phoenicians. This would involve not just love, but also war, which is interesting because is love a incentive or a catalyst for war? That is a kind of ancient topic. One's mind immediately goes to Helen of Troy. This Astarte, as it was not just the Phoenicians extending out to Carthage, Malta, Sicily, Cyprus. And this reoccurring trope as well in many different cultures, not all, but for instance, a fertility deity in the Zulu tradition, representing both the harvest season and the spring rains. And this spring rains, I think, is particularly poignant because that is also shared, for instance, with Dodola, which is a Slavic fertility deity, earth fertility and rain. And there was this reoccurring subject matter of the male fertility of the macrocosmos, the sky, the heavens being the lightning bolt, and the female fertility being the rain. And in this case, Dodola is the rain and Perun is the god of thunder. And so that bolt is somewhat invocative. That's that phallus kind of stuff. Or Thor's hammer. This practice, these rituals that honor Dodola, carry on into the modern Slavic day. There are these ceremonies where children and the young girls adorn themselves with leaves and sing songs. They are sprayed with water, and in this ceremony, it is in hopes of summoning or conjuring, soliciting the rain, and the rain that gives fertility to all life. And it's not hard to see why this happens, in the sense that the land is growing barren, the land is growing dry, the rain comes and things bloom. So there's this immediate observation of this creation or this growth, this nourishing. And so since the world is like you, then this is a gift from the mother. I hope that gets across. There is, of course, other Slavic beliefs, and other Slavic goddess that is Ziva or Ziwia. I've seen a few names, and I'm of course not sure if I'm pronouncing properly. Associated with life, fertility, the primordial mother and the major mother of the pantheon. And this name is related to the Norse Sif goddess, which of course gives credo to the mutual ancestry through etymology of this earth goddess, as it becomes Sif over here and as it was Ziva over here. This, of course, takes on its own connotations. For instance, if this deity is being worshipped in Belarus, then it is the earth goddess. Whereas if it is being worshipped in Serbia, then this one is the protector of children and the bringer of life. And that's the other trope, the protector of children, as it is, that role is given to many different goddesses throughout many different traditions. For instance, Artemis, if we go back to the Greeks. So you can see with immediate observation that the roles of this initial fertility deity are being given individually to different goddesses as paganism develops. It's no longer one encompassing all these traits mother. It's being categorized. It's being fractured out. And here's the other instance. There are fertility deities that are male as well. And that should already be noted, because as we saw with moon goddesses, there were also plenty of moon gods. None of these things are ever quite solely kept engendered. Bes, god, protector of the household, mothers and young children. He and his wife Beset would cure infidelities. This Beset is also a god of war. Notice again, war and love, sexuality, humor, music, and dancing. All of these things attached to the deity of fertility. During the Ptolemaic era, there was a cult that surrounded Bes that got taken in by the Phoenicians and the Romans. This will come up later, these cults of sexuality. Here's another hint for later. During the time of Alexander's conquest, he brought the Greek culture to the Middle East, and by extension to those of Israel. And the Greeks, as many know, were very open sexually, which we'll discuss more as well. This was immediately met with some concern by the Israelites because before even the Greeks showed up, there was this trend of thought. These disasters, these natural disasters that had happened to the Jews, the Assyrian conquest, or the destruction of the temple, these things were thought of as punishments for idolatry. Now here, let's break this down. It goes like this. Idolatry leads to misguided sexual behaviors, i.e., porneia. Yeah, and you're hearing that right. Porneia, which means sexual immorality. Idolatry leading to sexual immorality, i.e., sexuality outside of a given contract, and thus collective disaster, death. Now that's very important. This idea, fostered way back in this time that we're in, of specific immoral sexual actions causing disasters. Is this not conjuring some Westboro Baptist Church vibes a little bit? So, of course, when the Greeks show up and they're displaying this open sexuality, the Israelites are a bit put off. Note for later. But when it comes to the Greeks, as we've discussed in the course before, it's really codified by Eros and Dionysus. And Eros is arguably, depending if we're following Orphism or what stories we're following, Eros could be the progenitor of all things. As noted, why did the gods get together in the creation story if there was not this passion or erotic drive towards each other? Why would anything procreate without this unification? But in another case, we could say Eros is born of Nyx and Erebus, or we could say Eros is born of Ares and Zephyrus, or just the chaos. But regardless, Eros is lust, Eros is passion, and thus fertility. And here we see that interesting case that the fertility deity is male. And it's interesting, just as a slight note, because this fertility aspect is indicative of both lovers, right? I mean, the act to be brought together is both masculine and feminine. Anyhow, the offerings to the temple of Eros would be vessels filled with oils or wine or jewelry or sacrifices or plants or flowers, all of these things in good conscience toward facilitating fertility or erotic passions. The word orgia means religious rituals, which of course would turn into the word orgy, which now has its own associations outside of the given religious context of which they were performed. So within the philosophy of the Greeks, and by extension Eros as a deity, there aren't boundaries to this sexuality. Eros would anyone could fall into infatuation, same sex, hetero relationships, it doesn't matter. This was very free love. And as the Romans took it, Eros turns into Cupid and gets associated with the cherub, which is not the right word for it. There's a whole story that goes into why this chubby cherub becomes, Eros. Or Eros becomes Cupid and then becomes this chubby cherub. Frequently, though, prior to this, depicted as blindfolded because love is blind. And Cupid came to represent more the god of pure love, whatever that means, pure love, which, we can go into psychoanalysis and all this too. But, as it is celebrated in our Valentine's Day. But of course, far from the point there. Lust, passion, and fertility. But then, of course, we also have the case of Bacchus. And in this case, it's the ripoff of the previous Greek Dionysus. And this specific aspect of the wine, the grapes, and what comes to be understood as debauchery, when actually this celebration, whether Bacchus or whether it's Dionysus, is this practice of letting go in all the tension of life and all the tension and norms and taboos that society is chronically compelling. You get the chance to just let it go. And this is liberation. And that's where it was really coming from in a genuine idyllic sense, that it's letting things happen as you genuinely, authentically are, to say what you mean, to act as you do, and to do what thou wilt, which will come up later. The freedom to perform, say, do what you feel, So at this time, now that we're with the Romans, we have these cults, which are previously mentioned, whether it was taking on Bes, or whether it was taking on Bacchus, or if it's the mysteries of Demeter, or Dionysus, or Magna Mater, or Bonadea. These are all these kind of secret religious cults, per se, orientations that facilitate the open expression of sexuality as it was happening. And these breakings of norms, these letting go ceremonies, would invite women to drink wine, which is against the patriarchy. They would be amongst the slaves, which is against the power structure of society. This was the time to dissolve those boundaries between peoples. But here we have the real, party pooper and the rise of Christianity. And this is going to hurt a bit. So it's the 2nd century, and there is this very strong attempt that we've covered on the course before of Christianity attempting to separate itself from its neighbors, i.e., in this case, particularly the Jews, which we saw this with their exercise of why they're against astrology, and here it is the exercise of why it's against sexuality. And not to say that it was coming out of nowhere, because remember the context of Judaism. The reaction of worshiping idolatry leads to sexual misconduct, which leads to natural disaster mentality. Okay? So in this case, the Christians were risking persecution unless they could make the claim or stake the argument that they were beneficial to society, to the Roman Empire. Because by the logic of the times, by the Roman ceremonies and religious orientations, the Christians were atheists. They didn't believe in the gods. They were atheists, you see. And so they need to prove, yes, that might be true by your thought, but we can show that we are not damaging. And so there was a series of letters, and there was this really open curtain call to Christians to decide, what do we think, how do we go forward, and what is our stance. And this was particularly provocative, because in this case it was framing Rome as tyrannical, that the root of all the evil that was plaguing Rome was the same logic: idolatry, which creates sexual deviance, and this deviance bringing disaster. And so this specific time in history shows this obsessive compulsion towards the topic of human sexuality. The urge of the body towards other bodies is to be thought of as lesser, and it ought not control one's life. To take from the philosophical tradition and say that the mind is supremely man, and thus that is what sets man apart, and thus we should focus on the mind and not give way to the body, because the body is animalistic and it is lesser. That's the dichotomy being set up here, which is, right away, we already have a session on it, but it's aestheticism. Ascesis, the idea of discipline. If an athlete disciplines their body in order to get into shape, a man must discipline his mind in order to get it into shape. Disciplining oneself against overeating, overdrinking, or sexuality. Aestheticism, which this is not the only place in the world that is going to be having this discussion, which we'll touch on a bit later. But this idea of controlling the passions, apatheia, is really the crux of where this is going to go way out of control. And there are some really hard to read documents from this time. Ideas such as, when a man is at the moment of sexual orgasm, he is at the heights of his deviancy, of where the devil is effectively controlling his mind and body. Of course, they didn't go full hog in this way. And what I mean is, they have to be like, it's okay if it's under marriage, which marriage had recently been invented, which is a subject of its own session, invented for the sake of political purposes, of course, and this ultimately serves a political purpose as well. If you can control human sexuality, and here's the appeal, if you can control human sexuality, it really keeps people in line. You put two together, you force them into a closed system, and accordingly, there's not going to be trouble. They're not going to cause trouble with people. If you keep adultery to the low, then people aren't going to be killing each other and acting all uncivil because of these dramas that ensue from sexuality. And the power of sexuality is highly charged. And since it's something of power, the nature of power in humankind is entropy inducing. So the Christians are saying only in marriage, which is great for political purposes because it keeps these things in confine, and ought not in any way be indulged outside of the contract. And here's the other ideas. Men have hot blood and women have cold blood. And that's why men are active and women are passive. Just like that. It blends with these ideas of their current medical schemas. And the only way a woman can get pregnant is on her back. And this is very important because this belief carries all the way into Christian missionaries, probably still to this day for all I know. I know, of course, when it comes to the missionary work in Asia or in Africa or here in the Americas with the indigenous, this is taught of as the only correct way to have sex, which is why it's called missionary position. Because sex is for procreation, we ought not indulge, and it is like a lesser, it's like we have to do this evil in order to perpetuate the species. And the reasons for that, the specific attitude, are all bound up in Genesis, which is currently being rewritten at this time. We'll get to that a bit. All the physical traits of the child were believed at this time as well to come from the man, was to come from the semen, and that the woman was simply an incubator that facilitates this birth. So you see, in all these things that I'm bringing up right here, I certainly don't enjoy bringing up these things, by the way. This is just displaying the cultural lean, the way how, like, an approach can facilitate not just one's beliefs about how to treat women and sexuality, but also it extends to the medical fields. It extends to the philosophical fields. Everything is tied around this specific approach. I hope you're getting a sense of that. And so there is this need to damn right now when it comes to the Christians staking out their own way of approach. So they're going to resurface that idea of porneia, which was brought up by the Israelites, which is that immoral sexuality, and the word subsequently by translation, fornication or forn, which is the means arches in Latin, which is a reference to prostitution. So accordingly, the word fornication comes to mean this same extension of porneia, which is that they are fornicators, heretics, sexually immoral. And then, of course, you can point to the Bible stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. These views of women don't stop in their coercion, which I did, oh man, I did a whole session on this, the history of female philosophers. Oh, the tragedy of women in society. It was one of them, like, I think in session 20 or in 30s. Anyway, these views of women lead to this idea that they are the problem. Because they must be. Men are the big boys, and they're great. And if Christianity is going to eventually sell itself to become the Holy Roman Empire, not just this idea of closed sexual behavior, i.e. marriage, is a good selling political point, but also the political point of absolutely turning on women will facilitate the political interests of patriarchy, which will, again, really slide them in, because paganism, as a general rule, has better acknowledgement of women. But in this case, if we really lean on the power structure, as Christianity is doing so aptly, it's going to be a good sell. And this is according to that. Women attemptively all use seduction to control and dominate men. The idea, it extends all the way into the Victorian. Since women are thought of as weaker, they have to come up with things by means of seduction. This would be a certain promiscuity, a certain behavior, a certain set of makeup or clothes, and that these are tools to control men. And this all goes back to the Garden of Eden, and this is how it was talked about, sincerely, redoing the story, because the story, it takes on many different forms. Again, this would be its own session, but here it is using the story of Genesis, utilizing the iconography of the fertility deity Pan, represented through the devil. The devil seduces Eve through the iconography of Pan, with his phallus, rather notable size, of course, and through this seduction, this is the fall. This is before the apple story, because the apple comes from appropriating the Celtic, where I traced it, at least. So this intercourse by means of lust is the idea of the originating sin, and Eve uses this lust, seduction, and seduces Adam, who would have otherwise been kept pure. And so thus, lust is what sent humankind into the chaotic entropy. And going so far as to say that Jesus's incarnation came to alleviate this lust. His sacrifice was to alleviate the sin of this lust. This is how serious it is. I have a bishop quoting here. It says, literally, open letter, It says, "You are the devil's gateway. You are she who violated the forbidden tree and broke the law of God. Because of the death you merited, even the Son of God had to die." It was this vitriolic. The sin of lust is why God had to send Christ to die. It's all women's fault. Notice, I'm going to pause. Notice where we began and contrast that with this. Okay. There needed to be some reproach, though. So the 2nd century also has these stories of Mary, not just the mother, but also Magdalene, which is a whole nother part of this to get into. But when it comes to the Virgin Mary, the story or the background as it was crafted was that which she was raised by priests in a temple, and that she never encountered evil, and that she never broke her virginity. Because it was just with God. But that doesn't really count. It was Immaculate Conception, virgin. And thus, Mary becomes the only way that women can be now. This is the only way. Given all these things that we just came up with, this is the only way women can be now. So this idea of chastity, this idea of celibacy, there is some sort of mention that we have to give to the Gnostics, as we've mentioned them before, but the Gnostics went so far as to never procreate. All of the body and material existence is a sin, created by a messed up deity, the Demiurge. And accordingly, we will never do anything that makes this continue. So effectively, they're just going to die out. And the Christians will eventually kill the Gnostics outright, like genocide. They'll kill the Cathars. But for this time, they're going to take this idea of celibacy and chastity, but not to its full extent, you see, which, by the way, the Gnostics weren't all like this. Some of them did have more free love associative acts with sexuality, but a lot of the time, the whole goal was just as long as it doesn't produce more life. Most often that was the case. But anyway, so with the Christians, they want to take this idea, this virtue, but not so far. We'll take it from them and we'll bring it back a little bit, and we'll say, just as long as it's in a Christian marriage, intercourse can be performed if it produces an heir. But of course, accordingly, if women are on menopause, or if women have shown that they are barren, they can't have sex because it's not to procreate. So the party has officially been pooped, man. It's over now. Because as we know, the power structure grows and grows and grows from here. The idea as well of this celibacy and chastity would be given its full extreme when it comes to the clergy. And this idea of that is to facilitate the idea of their holiness, or of their aura of exceptional spiritual quality. The fact that they have never had sex or produced any sexuality thusly. And so the expectation of the clergy would be to fully fulfill the initiatives of the Gnostic, which is super interesting. But anyhow, there is some debate too on whether or not Christians during this time, especially the clergy, would just straight up castrate themselves. There is actual debate about this. There is a quote, Matthew 19:12. Jesus says, "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Let anyone accept this who can." This is interesting because obviously it plays into the part, this whole thing that we've been crafting, that I'm just, this is my sacrifice for God. I'm going to do it myself. Yet, the subject of asexuality in contemporary religious circles is really wild. Like, it goes back and forth. I mean, as far as I could look into it, asexuality is a confusing subject, and it is dealt with differently depending on the congregation. One would go as so far as to completely distance themselves, say that they're not people, and the other would go so far as to say that this plays exactly into, this is great. This is great. The lack of sexual desire, that's amazing. Where can you help everybody else do that, I guess? Oh man, oh man, oh man. But given all that, we can see with immediacy how this attitude that was conjured for political purposes in like the 200 to 300 effectively and so on, still has sway. And even that approach of tragedy coming because of idolatry from sexual misconduct equals disaster via the Westboro Baptist Church, that one harkens back all the way to like 600 BC. I mean, it's old, man. Anyway, let's change the perspective a bit, because simultaneously, or at least within the same couple hundreds of years, we have developments in Hinduism on this specific subject. And in Hinduism, as an example, there are these kind of approaches of life, these basic ideas of the aims of life, which are kama, which is sexuality, pleasure, artha, which is prosperity, materially, dharma, which is duty, harmony, and moksha, which is liberation. And that, as I listed them, they grow more and more important. So the least important one is pleasure, kama. So here it is acknowledging, let's just say culturally, because religiously and culturally are very intertwined when it comes to Hinduism. Sexuality is not taboo in the same horribly aesthetic way that it came to be in Christianity. And sex is not thought of as inherently wrong. There are, of course, ways that it can take one off the other paths, right? Like if your sexuality affects your material prosperity or your duty, or if it affects your ability towards liberation, it's not good. But otherwise, it's good. So in this case, sexuality is sacred as well, because it represents this impulse towards expansion. And this goes back to that initial sexuality creation wonderment. It acknowledges that. But of course, Hinduism's history with Jainism and so forth is much more of a through line than the very truncated story of general religious traditions in the, let's just say, Western world, in colonial Europe specifically. So from this, we have the Kama Sutra, which is a notorious book created in the 4th century. And this elaborately goes through the discussion and subject of sexuality and sexual behavior. But this is not a religious text by any means. In fact, it goes against religious beliefs in the way that at certain parts, for instance, it teaches one how to seduce somebody else's wife, which would be not okay by the previous ethics that I painted. That would definitely be affecting one's harmony. That would definitely be affecting one's material prosperity. So this is not a, let's just say, even though the word doesn't apply, a canonical text, but this Kama Sutra shows Hinduism's society like its availability, that something like this could be produced, could be talked about at length, and not become this horrid heresy. The Kama Sutra still exists. You can go read it. So it's, in the case of the Kama Sutra, it doesn't represent, yet it does exist in the ancient world, and it was made. And by extension, you have the Ananga Ranga, which I don't know if I'm saying that right. Translation is the stage of love, or the stage of the bodiless one. This is another text, came much later, 15th, 16th century, and this time takes away that immorality and just focuses on the absolutely detailed discussion of human sexual intercourse. And this stated goal was to keep the husband and wife together, because the idea was that men, as one quote says, in reference to men, they regard women only as in an animal point of view, and this animalistic infatuation that men towards women. But I'm paraphrasing, such men must be looked upon as foolish and unintelligent. This book is composed with the objective of preventing such. So to investigate the art of love and love making, in order for the thorough and varied enjoyment of women and men. So you can see this is getting much more plural, much more egalitarian in a sense, and is countercultural to the otherwise patriarchy. Hence, if one does this, facilitates the passion, learns how to facilitate this passion in the closed setting, in the good setting that it is, they can acquire thus divine knowledge, and hence move forward into the transmigration of souls, which this specific text, written by a poet, by the way, would be facilitating the greater aim of the Hinduism ethic that I painted earlier, facilitating Kama towards moksha. And you do see other cases between the taking over of Christianity, with its sexual taboo, sexual sin, lust is horrid abomination. You do see exceptions of that across the world in the meantime. For instance, in Vietnam, you have Lia Han, this princess, which managed to form this, there was a cult formed around her in Vietnam that was an ensemble of women. This Lia Han was suppressed by the Communist Party when that came to be. This cult was thought of as an extension to Taoism, and after that suppression came into popularity again. This was hard for me to find information on, though, but I did want to give it some lip service, because there is a lot of debate on this subject of, for instance, what does the cult practice? What does it look like? When is this Lia Han an actual person? Is it a made up story? If it was a person, it seems like she would be dated towards the 1400s to 1500s in actual life and was made mythic after. But these festivals, these ceremonies around Lia Han celebrate this disposition towards freedom of the woman, in the sense that Lia Han moved between the heavens and the earth and was not tied down by family, by children, by the expectations of husbands. This idea of feminine liberation, as it was, again, this kind of release valve for all this horrible pressure. And of course, I can't, if I were to say that, Christianity really takes the cake when it comes to this enforcement of patriarchy, it really isn't the case. This is a much more complex story than that. But specifically when it comes to the sexual taboos, When it comes to the greater story of the West, Christianity definitely was the one holding front spear, let's just say. But we see here that this, such as this case, with this case in Vietnam, where there are exceptions throughout this time to this overruling approach towards the woman, towards sexuality. And we're really going to see the fight back, the lashing back when it comes to the idea of sex magic. I'm going to run through this quickly because I really didn't want to get too lost. I have linked all the books for this in the description. So look through there if you want to read a lot of these manuscripts written by these occultists that I'm going to talk about briefly are fully available to you. Anyhow, Pascal Beverly Randolph is the first accredited one when it comes to the history of sex magic. He's a very interesting character, worthy of research beyond the limits of this subject. An eclectic physician who studied spiritualism and magnetism. A part of the Rosicrucian fraternity in 1846. Allegedly brought the Rosicrucian wisdom from his visit in Europe, where he allegedly was in the midst of Levi, which is a big name in the history of occultism. Following this trip, he brings this back, starts the order, or revitalizes the order here in the States through occult ritual, through reading and uncovering these ancient manuscripts, so forth. Randolph would ultimately come to focus a linchpin on the idea of will. And here it comes. You know it's going to come up later with Crowley. Do what thou will. Exercising volition through thought. This specific idea, too, of coming up with the idea of blending, which would be to channel the soul of the deceased while also maintaining the will of the individual, not giving up your body fully to the channeling act. By extension, starts to give advice on issues of sexuality, which if you even brought up the subject in this day, you would be thought of as one of those free love pagan types. This belief from Randolph, though, as it blossoms out from this idea of will, is to discover the great secret about sexuality, what it's really on about, without the girders of the idea of Christianity. And he became infatuated on this mysterious fluid produced by both loving parties when sexually aroused, and hypothesized that this fluid had some sort of exact secret tie to marital success and happiness between individuals. So this fascination with this fluid went on accordingly, that if one could develop ways to unblock in every way possible the production of this fluid, then ecstasy or fulfilling sexual practice would be had. This is the beginning of sex magic, this infatuation with the fluid, the mysterious fluid. And this goes on. The next step is Karl Kellner, Rosicrucian, interest in Freemasonry, interest in Eastern mysticism, world traveler, learned from three adepts, a Sufi, the Tantric traditions, and the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, which is pretty obscure. Established the great lodges of Freemasonry, put moves so that Freemasonry could accept women into their ranks, because prior to that, purely patriarchal, started making the moves so that occultism would embrace women. Has his own leg in on this game. There are many movers and shakers when it comes to the history of sex magic. The big one, though, that I feel like doesn't get the credit deserved is Ida Craddock, which she, as she was raised a fundamentalist Christian. by a mother who converted after having interest in spiritualism and occultism. As she was raised intensely religious and had to know everything about it. So much of the world, in every kind of way, was completely unknown to Ida. And as she grew up, she was already showing signs that she was highly intelligent from a very early age in her ability to memorize and contend in religious discussions. Out the gates, when she's in college, she right away would have been the first female graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, but it got retracted. She learned stenography. She taught it in Philadelphia and wrote a textbook on the subject. She was teaching women this skill in order for them to employ themselves and to exercise their own independence. Radical. This is the 1880s. This is radical. From here, there is this discovery of occultism. And from here, she leans fully in, attending the theosophical classes at the Unitarian churches. Cites everything, read everything, knows everything there is to know about the Bible, reads the Hindu, both offshoot manuscripts, Upanishads, Vedas, you name it, Greek philosophers, occultists, academics, historians, anthropologists, you name it. She was on. And went headfirst into this discourse, not just academically, but personally, with sexual relations. As the story starts, she had two lovers. The first man was a younger man, very orthodox, not a satisfying lover. Then she meets the ex-clergyman, the second lover, and he is heretical, as it's put. And he has taught himself this technique, kareza, which is the ability to withhold ejaculation. Her specific intercourse with this man blew the lid off of this taboo. Undiscovered heights of sexual ecstasy, as it's put. Superseding, transcending the conventional way. And so this experience was divine. Now let's back up a bit. The suppression of human sexuality had been in practice for, at this point, 1600 years straight. The absolute suppression of this genuine aspect, this innate compulsion, as we saw it reverentially in the primordial past. And so when you let go, this is like Dionysus Supreme. Once you let it go, this is her experience of the divine. This esoteric sensuality. And where it can be found in all the other explanations of the world through all the different religious traditions outside of just the one that ruled the day. Accordingly, her buddies, too, bring back the Kama Sutra, the Anangaranga, these things previously mentioned, get kind of a renaissance outside of India, because this is beginning the reproach of the subject of sexuality, something long left undiscussed. And so the Western world, emerging from this Victorian complex, is objectively trying to investigate this sexuality. And she writes several manuscripts and claimed to be the wife of an angel. This attracted the attention of Crowley, and he read her book Heavenly Bridegrooms and said, amongst many other things, that it is one of the most remarkable human documents ever produced. It is one of the books of incalculable value for every student of occultism. No magic library is complete without it. Quote, she would also go on to produce another work called The Psychic Wedlock. And this outlines a 3-degree system of initiation through sexual techniques. It is very dense. Squarely opposed to exactly what Christianity had always been trying to promulgate. The 1, put the lid on sexuality. 2, it is run by men. This right of husbands over the duties of wives. This open discussion of sexual matters really was hugely offensive to people. The moralists, the conventionalists, the status quo, they just wouldn't have it. And the open critique that she's writing about sexuality, but she's not married. And that was a hot take. How can she know about sexuality if she's not married? Because the two can't be thought of as different at this time. And what she does is she says that she's married to an angel, like I said, named Soph. And that this is the psychic wedlock. And she'll show you how. She wrote this whole manuscript showing you how. and then says, is this not what the Virgin Mary did? Did she not become in psychic wedlock with the heavenly bridegroom? Isn't this exactly what you want me to do? Amazingly clever. Amazing. Please look into her more. A quote from the Confessions of Crowley. The nightmare world of Christianity vanished at the dawn. The detestable mysteries of sex were transformed into joy and beauty, and the obsession of sin fell from my shoulders into a sea of oblivion. All of this is liberation. This is the snapback. It took this long to get enough gusto, to get enough inertia. Sex magic practiced through, facilitated, conjured through occultism harkens back to the pagan past, harkens back to the Paleolithic, wishes to revive the innate state of the human condition. This, although you can consider it extreme, you certainly can, and it has to be, because it's dealing with polarities. It must be extreme to try to work out some sort of greater balance to this horrible, oppressive seriousness that had been overtaking humankind for 1,600 years. And of course, Crowley would lean full in. He would do anything he could to make them revile, whether he was masturbating or making a part of this ritual acts of homosexuality, just to get them to gawk, because he would be anything to spite this, anything to get in the way of this, anything that could be done. And this act too, and he's the one that brings up the idea of Tantra as being somehow related to this act of sex magic. And this is a misconception. I can use this podium to clear this up. The association with Crowley and Tantra is this very loose knowledge that he had of Tantra. Tantra would be utilizing, the esoteric Tantra would be utilizing what would otherwise be your sexual energy or sexual motivation, and to point that instead towards spiritual motivation or spiritual pattern. So much of what humanity does and much of what motivates us is sexuality. Putting ourselves in certain places with the potential to meet certain people, or putting ourselves in subjects of love, or facilitating greater um, um, beauty, for instance, or long withstanding relationships. This idea of connecting. Sexuality can be the central impetus towards what we do, and to instead use that power, because it's very powerful, point it towards something else, point it towards a supreme motivation. That is what Tantra does. Whereas Crowley's associations are from different spaces, but Tantra would be associated with Crowley. So from this day forward, there is still this conception that Tantra is like Crowley's sex magic. And that's what they do. When in fact, as I kept looking into this, I can't find anything that substantiates that other than Crowley's association with bringing up Tantra and the fact that it was unknown. And the previously mentioned tantric motivation to solicit, facilitate, point sexual energy towards other means. So that is everything I wanted to touch on. That is effectively the history of human sexuality and religion. But I want to take the time to point to a few things here. So where are we at now? And this taboo still exists. This taboo is still, it's weakening, but it's still pounding at the doors of people's psyche. When it comes to shame, when it comes to that's not proper. And these taboos of the Christian aim have always been the same. This vehement fundamentalist disapproval of homosexuality goes back to this. Idolatry leads to ill human acts, porneia, and leads to natural disaster. You don't Sodom and Gomorrah us, basically. And that's where they stand. And they've remained firm. These innumerable people across all these years, they've stayed firm on that. But the secular, let's just call it that, the other was brought about, like this more candid, this more like, hey, do what thou wilt. Hey, you can do that. We're not going to shame you, right? You can exercise yourself. You can facilitate your desires, right? You can become of yourself, self-actualize. This was really, this door that we can exercise now was broken open by traditions like sex magic. Our past, our most primordial self, is unashamed and better understands the natural power and nuance that comes with sexuality. Not power over, but power with sexuality. And the wisdom of how this impulse, this impulse towards expansion, towards unification, is magical, sincere, authentic, deep into the very essence of our being. Made us something to be at all. So I have no calling card here. This is the history. I don't know where it goes. But this is where it's been. And this is why the climate looks the way it looks. We still have the old man, and we have this revival simultaneously existing in our psyches, battling for room, as it's been for about 100 years now, and specifically talking the Western world. So, that was fun. Bye for now.